On the night of April 18, 1775, a Boston silversmith named Paul Revere rode out of the city on a borrowed horse to warn that British regulars were marching toward Lexington and Concord. Every American schoolchild learns some version of that ride: the lantern signal hung in the Old North Church, the crossing of the Charles River, the alarm carried house to house through the Massachusetts countryside before dawn. Fewer people learn what his own father's baptismal certificate actually says, because it does not say Revere at all. Says Rivoire, a French Huguenot name, entered into a parish register more than 3,000 miles from Boston, in a small town near Bordeaux, in a kingdom where the family carrying it had been marked, officially and permanently, as a threat to the Catholic state. The man who would become Paul Revere Sr. was born an ocean and a language away from the city his son would make famous, a French-speaking child in a Huguenot household outside Bordeaux, under a name his own grandchildren would barely recognize. He arrived in Massachusetts as a teenager who had already crossed an ocean to escape a persecution that had scattered his relatives across at least 3 countries, and within a single generation his name, his accent, and nearly every visible trace of where he came from had been folded into the identity of colonial Boston so completely that his son would grow up to become one of the most quintessentially American figures the Revolution ever produced. The record of how that happened, and what survived it, sits today in parish registers, apprenticeship papers, a Boston probate file, and a letter Paul Revere himself wrote decades later, trying to find his way back to a family he had never met. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand why a French surname became something worth setting aside, you have to go back further than Paul Revere's birth, back to 1685, when King Louis XIV signed the Edict of Fontainebleau and revoked the protections French Protestants had held for close to a century under the earlier Edict of Nantes. France in the 1500s and 1600s contained a substantial Protestant minority, the Huguenots, concentrated in the south and west of the country, in trading towns and river valleys where Reformed congregations had taken root during the Reformation. The Edict of Nantes, signed in 1598, had granted them the right to worship, to hold public office, and to fortify a number of towns for their own protection, an uneasy arrangement that lasted for generations until Louis decided a religiously unified Catholic kingdom mattered more than the peace it had bought him. The years leading up to the revocation were not gentle. Royal dragoons were billeted directly in Huguenot households, a practice that became known as the dragonnades, and the soldiers were given wide license to make life in those homes unbearable until the family agreed to convert. After 1685, the pressure became law. Protestant worship was outlawed outright. Huguenot churches, sometimes called temples, were torn down. Pastors were given 2 weeks to leave the kingdom or face the galleys, and ordinary Huguenots, the merchants, weavers, vintners, and silversmiths who made up the bulk of the community, were legally forbidden to leave the country at all, which meant that leaving became something done in secret along smuggling routes toward the Swiss border or the Atlantic coast, often at night, often at the cost of whatever property was left behind. Some families kept worshipping in remote hiding, gathering in fields, forests, and quarries far from any village where an informer might notice, a period French Protestant history remembers as the désert, the wilderness, a word that describes both the literal countryside where these secret congregations met and the spiritual isolation the whole community now lived inside. Others outwardly conformed as so-called new converts, attending Catholic Mass on Sundays while keeping their old faith privately at home, a distinction that historians studying the period still have trouble sorting out family by family, because the entire point of the arrangement was to leave no clean written record of what anyone actually believed. A family could spend 2 full generations as nominal Catholics on paper, baptizing children in the parish church because the law required it, while quietly raising those same children on Reformed scripture and Reformed hymns behind closed doors. And the only way later genealogists can even suspect that pattern is by noticing a family that kept marrying within a small circle of other suspiciously similar households long after any purely Catholic family in the same village would have widened its choices. Somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 Huguenots fled France in the years surrounding the Revocation, by most estimates one of the largest religious displacements in early modern European history. French Protestants themselves came to call this scattering the refuge, a single word that stood in for an entire generation's worth of broken households, abandoned workshops, and children smuggled across borders in the false bottoms of carts. The exodus drained France of a disproportionate share of its skilled artisans. Its silk weavers, clockmakers, goldsmiths, and silversmiths, trades where Huguenot families had specialized for generations, and where the host countries receiving them were only too glad to absorb the expertise France had just thrown away. They scattered into Protestant England, where relief committees and a French-language church on Threadneedle Street in London helped process new arrivals, into the Dutch Republic, into Prussia, where Frederick William welcomed skilled refugees into Berlin by the thousands, into the Cape of Good Hope, and into the English colonies of North America, where small Huguenot communities took root in places like New Rochelle in New York and the South Carolina Low Country. The Rivoire family lived in Riocade, a small town in the Guyenne region near Bordeaux, in wine and river trade country where Protestant families had been established for generations before the revocation. What happened to them specifically in the years immediately after 1685 is less completely documented than the broad sweep of the Exodus, which is common for families outside the merchant elite, whose personal papers rarely survived the disruption. What the surviving parish and family record does show is that by the time Apollos Rivoire was born in Riocade in approximately 1702, roughly 17 years after the revocation, his family was still identifiably Huguenot in a country where that identity carried real legal risk, whether they were practicing in secret, nominally converted while keeping the old faith privately, or navigating some version in between. It is into that unresolved and dangerous space that Apollos was born, and it is out of that space that his family made the decision to send him away. His plan, according to the family's own later account, was to place Apollos somewhere his religion would not define his legal status, and that meant somewhere outside France entirely. He was still a boy, by most reconstructions somewhere around 13 years old, when he left Riocade for the last time. Family tradition places a relative already established outside France as the one who helped arrange the next leg of the journey, though the surviving sources do not agree closely enough on the specifics to say exactly who that relative was or precisely where he was based, a gap that is familiar to anyone who has traced a refugee-era family line back far enough. What the documented record picks up more clearly is Boston, where by the early 1720s, Apollos Rivoire had arrived and been placed as an apprentice with John Coney, one of the most respected silversmiths working in the city at the time. Coney's shop was exactly the kind of place where a young refugee with no trade of his own could become someone, a workshop where a teenager learned to hammer, anneal, and engrave precious metal into the tankards, spoons, and communion vessels that Boston's merchant class wanted for their homes and churches. Boston in the early 18th century supported a silver trade unusually large for a city its size, driven by a merchant class that treated silver plate the way later generations would treat a stock portfolio, a way to hold wealth that could be melted down or sold if a ship went missing or a market collapsed, and a skilled apprentice with steady hands had genuine room to rise inside that trade regardless of where he had been born. Coney died in 1722, before Apollos' training was complete, and the apprenticeship record grows thinner after that point. But Apollos evidently finished his training, possibly under one of Coney's former journeymen, and by the middle of the decade had established himself as an independent silversmith. In 1729, he married Deborah Hitchborn, whose family had already been in Massachusetts for multiple generations, tied to a wharf on Boston's North End waterfront that still carries the Hitchborn name today. Marrying into a family that old was, in its own way, as decisive a step toward becoming unmistakably Bostonian as changing his surname would be, since it meant his children would grow up with an English mother's relatives filling half their world, an English mother's speech in the house, and an English mother's family history to draw on whenever anyone asked where the family came from. It was around this period, according to Paul Revere's own later account, that Apollos changed his name. The reason he gave, in the explanation his son recorded, was practical rather than sentimental. Rivoire was difficult for his English-speaking neighbors to pronounce, and Revere was close enough in sound that people could say it correctly on the first try. He chose it himself, deliberately, the way a man chooses a tool that fits his hand better than the one he was given. A name that had marked his family as a persecuted religious minority in one country became, in another, simply a Boston tradesman's surname, indistinguishable on paper from any other English name on the street. Within one choice made by one immigrant teenager turned young husband, 3 generations of French Protestant history became invisible to anyone who did not already know to look for it. Apollos was not unusual in making that choice, and that is part of why his family is worth studying rather than treating as a curiosity. Colonial Massachusetts, like most of British North America, offered real advantages to anyone who could present as unmistakably English, and real disadvantages to anyone who could not. Naturalization law in the period drew sharp lines between subjects born in English territory and foreigners who had to petition for rights that native-born colonists simply held by birth. A French surname on a shop sign, a French accent in a courtroom, a French name on a land deed, any of these could complicate business in ways that a tradesman with a family to support had every incentive to avoid. Huguenot refugees who settled in South Carolina and New York sometimes kept their French names for a generation or two, particularly where they clustered together in congregations that could sustain some version of the old language in worship. The Boston Huguenot community was smaller and more scattered, without that same critical mass, and the Rivoire family's path, arriving with no relatives nearby, apprenticing into an English-run trade, marrying into an old Boston family, reflects exactly the kind of environment where Anglicization happened fast and happened completely, not because anyone forced it at gunpoint, but because every incentive in the system pointed the same direction. Apollos Rivoire was also not alone in the more specific sense of being a Huguenot refugee who ended up shaping early American history under a name that gave no hint of where his family had come from. Peter Faneuil, the Boston merchant whose name is attached to Faneuil Hall, the meeting house that would later host some of the Revolution's most important gatherings, descended from a Huguenot family that had fled France for the Netherlands and then for Boston, arriving in roughly the same period and the same city as the Rivoires. James Bowdoin, the Massachusetts governor whose family name is carried today by Bowdoin College in Maine, descended from a Huguenot merchant named Pierre Baudouin, who left France for Ireland and then for New England after the revocation, anglicizing Baudouin into Bowdoin along the way. Elias Boudinot, who would go on to serve as president of the Continental Congress, carried a Huguenot surname that had survived largely unchanged, a reminder that the pressure to anglicize was real but not universal. John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the United States, descended from Auguste Jay, a Huguenot merchant who fled France as a young man and settled in New York rather than Boston. Elias Boudinot's own family traced back to La Rochelle, one of the great Huguenot strongholds on the French Atlantic coast, and a city whose Protestant population had been besieged and starved into submission by royal forces decades before the revocation even arrived, which meant the Boudinots had already lived through one round of religious warfare before 1685 made, leaving a matter of survival rather than choice. None of these men grew up thinking of themselves primarily as French, and most people who know their names today have no particular reason to connect Faneuil Hall, Bowdoin College, or the first Chief Justice's family history back to 1685 and the Edict of Fontainebleau at all. What connects them is not a shared bloodline, but a shared pattern, a specific and well-documented wave of religious refugees who arrived in the English colonies within a few decades of each other, assimilated at different speeds depending on where they landed, and left behind surnames that read today as simply American, whether they kept their French shape or not. Paul Revere's family sits inside that pattern rather than outside it, which is part of why the letter he eventually wrote matters as more than a personal curiosity. It is a rare surviving case of one of those descendants actually going looking, in writing, for the specific chapter of the pattern that applied to his own family, rather than simply inheriting an anglicized name and letting the question of where it came from die out with the last person who still remembered. Paul Revere was born in the final days of 1734, one of at least 11 children Apollos and Deborah would have together, though not all of them survived to adulthood, which was ordinary for the period. By the time young Paul was old enough to understand anything about where his father came from, Apollos Revere, as he now signed himself, was a settled and reasonably prosperous Boston craftsman, a member of a congregational church, a man whose accent may have carried traces of France, but whose household, by every surviving indication, ran in English. Paul grew up learning his father's trade the way sons of artisans did throughout the colonial period, starting in the shop as a child and absorbing the discipline of the hammer and the crucible before he was old enough to shave. By the time the imperial crisis between Britain and its American colonies came to a head in the 1760s and 70s, he had built a reputation in Boston that had nothing to do with his father's origins and everything to do with his own skill and his own politics. He engraved the print of the Boston Massacre that helped turn a chaotic and disputed street shooting into a rallying image for the patriot cause, working from a design borrowed, not entirely honestly, from another Boston artist named Henry Pelham, which says something about how competitive the propaganda war already was years before a shot was fired at Lexington. He served as a courier for the Massachusetts Committee of Safety and the Sons of Liberty, riding between Boston and other colonial capitals with news and resolutions in the years leading up to the war, which is what made him an obvious choice on the night of April 18, 1775, to be one of several riders sent out to warn that British troops were on the move. He was captured by a British patrol partway through that ride and never actually reached Concord himself, a detail the popular version of the story tends to leave out, though the alarm reached its destination anyway, carried the rest of the way by other riders. During the war itself, his record was not one of unbroken success. He held a militia command as a lieutenant colonel of artillery and took part in the Penobscot expedition of 1779, an attempt to dislodge a British fort on the coast of what is now Maine that ended in one of the worst naval disasters of the entire war for the American side, and Revere was court-martialed afterward over his conduct during the retreat, though he was ultimately acquitted. It is a detail his later reputation tends to smooth over, the same way the popular version of his ride smooths over his capture before Concord, and it is worth including here precisely because a documentary record that only preserves the flattering parts of a life is not much better than the erased parts of his father's. After the war, he rebuilt his standing and expanded from silversmithing into gunpowder manufacturing, then into a foundry that cast cannon and church bells, and eventually into rolling copper sheeting, an operation that survives today as Revere Copper Products. None of that career required a single reference to Riocade or the Edict of Fontainebleau. It was built entirely on the identity his father had spent a lifetime constructing, an identity with no visible French edges left on it at all. What makes the Rivoire history recoverable at all, rather than lost the way so many immigrant origin stories are lost, is that a handful of physical traces survived on both sides of the ocean. In France, the parish registers of Riocade and the surrounding Guyenne countryside preserve baptismal and family entries for Rivoire, stretching back well before Apollos's birth, the ordinary Catholic-administered record-keeping of the period, which, in an odd twist, is often the only place a persecuted Protestant family's vital events were formally logged at all. In Boston, apprenticeship and guild records tied to John Coney's shop, combined with property records, marriage records, and the probate file filed when Apollos Rivoire died in 1754, created a documentary skeleton that later genealogists could reconstruct. And on the family side, there was memory, the kind that survives not as an official record, but as something told at a table, and half forgotten by the time it reaches the next generation. What is unusual about this particular family is that one of its members, at the height of his own fame, decided the memory was worth chasing back down into an actual record before it disappeared for good. For most of Paul Revere's adult life, contact with France was not realistic. Britain and France spent much of the 18th century at war with each other, and Massachusetts was a British colony until 1776, which meant a Boston silversmith had no practical channel back to relatives in Guyenne, even if he had wanted one. The Revolutionary War changed that. France allied itself with the new United States, French ships operated in American waters, French officers served alongside American troops, and for the first time in Paul Revere's life, writing to France stopped being an abstraction and became something a person could actually attempt. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Sometime in the years after independence was secured, when transatlantic mail between the United States and France had become realistic again, Paul Revere wrote a letter addressed to relatives he had never met, attempting to reconnect with the Rivoire side of a family his own father had spent a lifetime putting distance between himself and. In it, according to the letter that survives among his papers, he set out what he understood of his father's story, that Apollos had been born in France to a family that practiced the Reformed religion, that the family had sent him away as a boy specifically to place him somewhere his faith would not endanger him, and that he had made his way eventually to Boston and built a life and a trade and a name that his son had inherited without ever fully knowing where it began. Revere was asking, in effect, for the French side of the family to fill in what his father had either never explained fully or explained only in fragments that had not survived intact by the time Paul was old enough to ask serious questions. This is worth pausing on because it inverts the usual shape of these stories. In most family erasure histories, it is the descendants, generations later, who go searching for a truth their ancestors buried. Here it was different. It was the son of the man who did the erasing, one generation removed, at the peak of his own public life, a man whose name was already attached to a revolution, who went looking for the identity his father had spent 30 years working to make invisible. Whether the letter reached anyone who could answer it in full, and what if anything came back across the Atlantic in response, is less clearly documented than the letter's existence and its contents. A small irony given how much of this story turns on documents surviving or not surviving. Today, the Huguenot Society of America, the Huguenot Society of Great Britain and Ireland, and French institutions such as the Bibliothèque de la Société de l'Histoire du Protestantisme Français in Paris maintain exactly the kind of genealogical infrastructure that lets descendants of families like the Rivoires trace a line back across the Atlantic, cross-referencing baptismal entries from towns like Riocade against refugee relief lists compiled by committees in London and Amsterdam in the 1680s and 90s, and checking those against colonial apprenticeship, marriage, and probate records on the American side. It is slow, paper-based work, the kind that depends on someone in an archive finding the right register and the right page, not the kind of instant answer a commercial genetic test can offer. That distinction matters here specifically, because no DNA sample from Paul Revere or his father exists to test. There is no swab, no exhumed remains, no genetic study that can put a number on how much of Apollos Rivoire's ancestry survives in his descendants today. And even if such a sample existed, a commercial genetic test would not be able to hand back a result that reads specifically Huguenot in the first place, since the Huguenots were not a distinct ethnic population in any genetic sense, only French Protestants who shared the same general ancestry as their Catholic neighbors and differed from them in faith rather than in blood. What a DNA test can sometimes offer, a broad regional signal pointing toward southwestern France, is not proof of a Huguenot ancestor any more than it would be proof of a Catholic one. The identity that mattered here was recorded in church membership and legal status, not in anything a genetic test could ever have detected, which is exactly why the paper record is not a consolation prize next to DNA evidence, but the only kind of evidence this particular story could ever have left behind, and why the genealogists who work this field spend their time in archives in Paris and Boston, rather than waiting on a laboratory result that this particular mystery was never going to produce. What exists instead is exactly what existed for most of history before genetic testing was possible: a paper trail, a family letter, and a set of parish and colonial records that happen to have survived when so many comparable ones did not. Broader population studies of Huguenot refugee descendants in England, the Netherlands, and North America do exist, tracing surname distributions and migration patterns across the diaspora the revocation created, and those studies confirm the general shape of what happened to families like the Rivoires. Rapid linguistic and cultural assimilation within 1 to 2 generations, surname anglicization or adaptation depending on the host country, and a documentary record that survives mostly in institutional archives rather than in family memory. For anyone watching this who suspects a French Protestant refugee sits somewhere in their own family tree, the practical search looks a great deal like the one that recovers the Rivoire story. Start with the surname itself and watch for a documented anglicization pattern, the way Rivoire became Revere, the way Baudouin became Baudouin, the way Leroy sometimes became King, Delanoy became Delano, or Fontaine occasionally became Fountain. Check church membership records rather than only census records, since French Reformed and later Congregational or Anglican church rolls often preserved a foreign-born ancestor's original name even after legal and business records had already switched to the anglicized version. If the trail points toward the late 1600s or early 1700s, and toward a family that seems to appear in the colonial record with no clear prior American generation, that gap is often exactly where a refugee crossing sits, waiting for someone to check the Huguenot Society's published refugee lists or the surviving French Reformed church registers in London and the Netherlands, both of which catalogued new arrivals as a matter of course. What is clear, whatever else remains uncertain, is that Paul Revere lived to see 83 years, dying in 1818, more than 80 years after his father crossed an ocean as a frightened teenager to become someone the historical record would no longer read as French. Still carrying a name his family had chosen deliberately, in a country his father had chosen deliberately, having spent at least one documented moment of his own life trying to reach back across that choice. The midnight ride made Paul Revere a symbol of a new nation asserting itself against an old one. The record his father left behind, and the letter Paul Revere wrote trying to recover it, tells a quieter and in some ways more complicated story, of a family that had already been forced to reinvent itself once before any of that began, in a country an ocean away, for reasons that had nothing to do with British soldiers, and everything to do with which church a person was permitted to enter on a Sunday morning. Somewhere in Riocade today, or in whatever remains of its old parish registers now held in a French departmental archive, a 13-year-old boy's name is still written down the way his family gave it to him, decades before an ocean and a persecuted faith and a Boston silversmith shop turned it into something else entirely, and it is that first entry, not the ride, not the engraving, not the copperworks, that is the actual beginning of this particular American story. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.